right, hello to some of our early attendees. Give me just a second. I'm going to be pulling our PowerPoint presentation up. And I do have multiple screens here, so I'm looking off into the distance. Okay. Oh, and I see the gallery has joined us. Let's do a couple mic checks. Kirk, I'll start with you. I am not hearing you.
Who are you asking? Were you asking me?
I was asking Kirk.
Oh, okay. Sorry about
Cameron,
that. How about now?
Oh, I hear you now.
All right.
Okay.
I had to allow this meeting to be recorded, I guess.
Interesting. So we got Kirk down. Cameron, I could hear you well. Rod, how about you?
Yep. Can you hear me?
I can. And then Katie?
Yes, testing 1, 2.
Yep, you're all good there. All right, and we do have some early joiners with us. So as we'll give people a couple minutes to filter in and sign into Zoom. Again, I apologize if I'm sort of looking off into the distance and sort of looking around. I'm toggling between different screens here. And we will start right at 5:30. We have an hour together, and I want to make sure that we have that full time to go through the presentation and answer any questions. So we'll be very prompt and we'll start at that time. For some of you early folks, I think we can go ahead and start a fun poll for you guys. So I'm going to launch that. And the question is, which format for MDT open houses do you normally prefer? And you can choose meeting in person, Zoom, or virtual meetings, or if there's some other option that I haven't listed here that you're thinking of, you're welcome to send those creative ideas my way. I'm definitely open to other options for meeting virtually or just doing these kind of meetings. Oh, it's interesting too. I'm seeing that in this session, we're seeing a lot of interest for meeting in person. And please know that that will never go away. We'll definitely always keep meeting in person. And there's also a decent amount of interest for meeting virtually as well. I know that that is often an easy way for people to get together. So thanks for your thoughts on that too. It's interesting too, because we did have our 12 o'clock session and we saw a lot of interest for those Zoom virtual meetings. So interesting to see the dynamic between these two different times. Definitely do feel free to fill out that poll as you're sort of filtering in, and we will get started right at 5:30. I hope everyone is having a good day so far, and hopefully you get to talk about some fun transportation stuff before you head off to dinner and your families. So we're glad to be with you all today and glad to have your time and your thoughts. It's definitely an important project for the community, and we're always grateful for any chance that we have to connect. We will get started in just a minute. I'm just checking our time down here. Looks like our Zoom, people who like Zoom is definitely catching up in the polls. So it's interesting to sort of see that. I'm not exactly surprised since we are meeting via Zoom. So probably a lot of interest with that. All right, and it is 5:30 now, so I'd like to get us started in the meeting. For those of you who don't know me yet, I am Takami Clark, and I'm guiding us through this presentation. Sort of as I'm scrolling through, I do see some familiar names popping into our meeting, so I'm really glad to see everyone. But for those who haven't attended these kind of open houses or haven't met me yet, I represent Big Sky Public Relations. We work for Montana Department of Transportation on communications for many different projects throughout the state. Some of you might recognize my name actually from Highway 78, Red Lodge to Luther, and I also work on that project as well. And I am the communications manager for US 212 Red Lodge to Roberts, and I'm available should you ever have any questions. Some of the things that MDT has hired us to help with is creating press releases for the media and hosting public meetings like this one. And like I mentioned before, we do usually like to host meetings like this in person, but due to COVID-19 and our concerns for public safety, we are hosting a virtual meeting. Also here with me in this presentation are members of Montana Department of Transportation, as well as engineering consultant Sanderson Stewart. Would you all like to say hi? And I'll start over with Cameron.
Hello, my name is Cameron Cloverdance. I'm with Montana Department of Transportation in the Consultant Design Bureau. My role on this project is I coordinate the effort between the consultant and other MDT personnel. Thank you.
Great. Rod, how about you?
Good evening, everybody. My name is Rod Nelson. I'm the Billings District Administrator for the Montana Department of Transportation.
Awesome. And Kirk?
Yeah, good evening. I'm Kirk Spalding. I work for Sanderson Stewart. We're the prime consultant on this project retained by MDT for the design of the highway. And I act in the role of a senior project manager.
Wonderful. I also wanted to take some time to introduce Katie Cleats from Big Sky Public Relations. She's monitoring any questions or comments that come through that Q&A system, and feel free to just type your thoughts and questions in there throughout the meeting. Katie, did you want to say hi?
Thanks, Takami. Good evening, everyone. As Takami said, I'm Katie Cleats, also with Big Sky Public Relations and helping with public involvement and supporting Takami in her great work. As we get moving forward with this presentation, as Takami had said, we do plan to save quite a bit of time at the end for questions. So you can ask those in the bottom of your screen. There's looks like 2 chat bubbles for the Q&A where you can type them in. I will just say that in our first session earlier today, we bumped it right at the end marker. So we'll try to group questions as they come in. So if you don't get a chance to hear exactly what you were looking for, Kami will share her contact information at the end, and you're welcome to follow up with her as well. But we'll do our very, very best.
Great note on that, Katie. Thank you for mentioning that. Again, my name is Takami, and I am serving as the communications manager for US 212 Red Lodge to Roberts. I'm here should you want to share any thoughts or if you have any questions at all. And my contact information will be shared at the end of the presentation should you ever need to get in touch. And the last thing I wanted to mention as well is that we are recording this presentation and placing it on the project webpage for viewing after the meeting. So you're welcome to share it and view it again and watch it whenever you like. And we really appreciate everyone who has taken the time to tune in with us today. It really means a lot to hear directly from the community and be able to touch base. So I'm super grateful for you all. And yeah, with that, let's get started. I'd like to now turn things over to Cameron.
All right, thank you. Yeah, I also would just like to thank you guys for all giving us a little bit of your evening today. And I'd like to start with looking at this project in relation to our plan for the overall corridor of US 212. We ended up splitting this corridor into 5 different projects. As you can see, if we start down at the south of the corridor down by Red Lodge, we had the first project was 8th Street to Robinson Lane, and that section has already been constructed. The next project is from Robinson Lane to 2 Mile Bridge Road and includes the intersection there with 2 Mile Bridge Road. And right now that section is further along in the design process, but due to constraints outside of MDT's control, it has been delayed and is almost on hold right now indefinitely. Then we have this project in blue, which is the Red Lodge to Roberts project that we're talking about today. And it will then tie into the Roberts project, which is shown in red, that has also already been completed through construction. And then lastly would be the section from Roberts to Boyd project. And we envision that one's further behind the project we're talking about today. And we envision completing it after this segment as well. I wanted to let you guys know too, feel free to ask any questions you want about this corridor. We know we don't always get together often enough to, to answer questions. So if you have questions, please feel free to ask them. However, we will be prioritizing this project, Red Lodge to Roberts. And if it looks like we are running short on time, we may not be able to answer all the questions about the other projects. I did also want to point out, we do have one unified vision for this whole corridor, and all these projects will tie into each other. There'll be no gaps. All right, let's go ahead and advance to the next slide. So we are talking about the US 212 Red Lodge to Roberts project. And right now we have a set of plans that we have developed, and we currently are reaching out. Well, we already have reached out to all the adjacent landowners and are starting conversations with them over the right of way that we need to build these plans. That's where we're at right now. We envision this process taking another year, could be delayed out to 2 years, depending on how these conversations go. And we've also, run into some headwinds of not being able to meet with everyone like we would normally do. So that's also added a little bit of a challenge as well. But hopefully we'll be able to work through all of those challenges and have a design ready to build as early as 2023. And I say as early as because that's where our funding comes into play, and that's kind of a little bit of uncertainty there. We hopefully will be able to go in 2023, but that will depend on our federal funding and how much we've been allotted, and also how much projects have been costing to build, and also mix in a little bit of different priorities there as well. So that's kind of where we're at right now and where we hope to be shortly. So next I will introduce Kirk, and he will kind of talk about the current condition of the road and dive into the details of our plan.
Yeah, thanks, Cameron. So a lot of people say, why this project? Why do we need to do anything now? Well, this is part of a larger project, an entire corridor study that identified deficiencies in the corridor, of which I want to mention a handful of those to all you folks. So obviously there's traffic growth along this highway with increases in tourism. Yellowstone Park seeing record years year after year after year. Interest growing in the community of Red Lodge and Roberts and the surrounding area. With the motorcycle rallies in Red Lodge and the parades and the rodeo and all that kind of stuff that draws a lot of people to and from here. So with that increase in traffic comes, believe it or not, some form of congestion in the sense that passing opportunities for folks are somewhat limited along through here, and people's impatience grows. And so, one of the needs here has been to increase the capacity on this facility to provide some more passing. So anyways, that's how we address the traffic element of this. The highway really hasn't been improved substantially since 2002. And, with any facility, any kind of infrastructure, over time it degrades. And with a highway facility, the more traffic that's on there and pounds on the surface, the more it needs to be addressed and eventually reconstructed, as is the case here. We will be tearing up the existing roadway and replacing the surfacing, doing a variety of improvements, which I'll touch on. This facility has very narrow shoulders on both sides, so it's not very conducive to cyclists on this route throughout a good chunk of it. I used to do the MS bike ride quite a bit, and so very familiar with this road and the narrow shoulders that are out there. So you know, it's important that we provide a location for, you know, bicycles to be able to go back and forth. It's a fairly popular roadway for that. Also to provide for the instance of broken down vehicles, you know, giving them somewhere to go. And the narrow shoulders do not provide that. And also to help with first responders so that vehicles can get out of the way. You know, should the emergency vehicle need to go by, they can have a place to get out of the way. Then obviously with one of the more recent developments out here, you know, the Amish buggies that are going to and fro have very little room to negotiate through the facility without being on just the main travel lane. So that's one of the deficiencies that we're trying to address. Now, flooding or, you know, excess drainage coming up against the highway and causing problems, those are obviously pronounced issues in this area. We have a substantial amount of water, spring water flowing out of the banks in that first mile close to Red Lodge with this project. And that water comes up against the road and soaks in under the road and can cause issues with frost heave and whatnot later on in the year. But the drainage conditions out here are such that we need to improve the roadside drainage ditches and separate the irrigation flow from the roadside drainage also. So those are some of the improvements that we're dealing with there. The roadside ditches will be larger and they provide room for snow storage so that we have less drifting across the highway. And then finally, the sight distance. You know, we have a lot of areas out here where, you know, there's a pretty high amount of animal collisions with vehicles on this route. And, you know, I think you could blame some of that in large part to people just the element of surprise with a deer just bouncing out in front of them because there's a lot of vegetation up against the road. Now, the backdrop to this image here maybe doesn't show that, but go down the road a little ways towards Red Lodge and it gets very narrow and the aspen trees and groves are right up against the road. And that's where we have a lot of the high frequency of animal collisions is up in that area. So improving sight distance, you know, by opening up the sides of the road, building these ditches, improving the alignment of the approaches for people's driveways and stuff so they're perpendicular to the road. I mean, there's quite a few things out here that need to be addressed in that sense, and improving the sight distance will go a long ways in improving the safety of this facility. So if you could advance the next slide. So what are we doing to improve these deficiencies that have been identified? Well, the biggest one is perhaps that we're adding passing lanes. You know, we go through a pretty arduous process to determine where passing lanes are appropriate. And with this project, we're going to be adding approximately 3.9 miles of passing lanes combined between northbound and southbound. So about 2.2 miles worth of northbound passing lanes. Those are about the reference post, about 72.5 to about 74.5 for the northbound passing lane, and about 1.7 miles of southbound passing lanes from around 79.5 to 81.5 mile post. And I'll show you guys here a little bit later some more detail on that. So the passing lanes will be big because, you know, in terms of highway safety, that's one of the biggest elements that we have to address is people making poor judgment decisions, getting impatient, and making bad decisions on when to pass. And some of it may not be their fault if they start the passing movement without enough acceleration and all of a sudden a car pops up in their view. So, you know, we're aiming to improve all of those conditions by flattening the grades a little bit in places and making it so that your sight distance is much better so you can see the headlights or an oncoming vehicle in some locations. So we are going to improve the nearly 10 miles of this roadway. We're going to be going forward with pulverizing the material. So we'll be recycling the material that's out here. We grind up the existing asphalt, mix it with the gravels, and we put that down as the base. And then we put a little bit of gravel on top and a mat of new asphalt. So, you know, it's a nice environmentally friendly approach to reconstructing these facilities where we reuse a lot of material. So it'll be a nice new facility. We will be in the top center there, you see the adjusting curves. Basically, we're talking more about it, taking the vertical curves that are out here, the ups and downs in the roadway and flattening them out so that they're more suitable for passing. and improve your ability to see things down the road quite a bit farther. Again, with the wildlife out here, that's very important. And as I mentioned before, adding the ditches. So, I mean, there's ditches out here along both sides, but they're kind of steep, and next to the roadway, they can be a bit of a perceived hazard. So we'll be flattening out some of that and putting in some larger ditches, as I said, for both drainage and snow storage. And that creates a nice little tunnel there on each side where you can see down the road quite a ways too for wildlife. We'll be adding a bus turnaround, and that is about a mile to the north of the community of Fox. And that allows the buses to safely negotiate and turn around, but it'll also double in that sense for a pickup drop-off area for the students. If parents want to pick their kids up there, it's going to be laid out that as such so they can do just that. And it allows the schools, or the Roberts School and the Red Lodge School districts, to both kind of spin around at that same location. And it's also going to, I guess I'll say, triple as a scale site. So the Motor Carrier Services of Montana have been looking for an opportunity for a location to do a weigh scale out here, and this is where they have picked. So the bus turnaround will be a fairly large sea of asphalt on the state property there, and double as both this bus turnaround area and a scale site. It's not the kind that's permanently maintained. This is a type B site, so it's turned on occasionally to check and see and make sure people are in compliance. So the widening, of course, the upper right one there of the 8-foot shoulders is a huge benefit to this project. It serves so many purposes, of which I touched on some, you know, for broken down vehicles, for people to pass on the right with caution, for the buggies, for bicyclists, for pedestrians, you know, lots of different benefits with having the wider shoulders, and that will match some of the other pieces of the corridor that have been completed already, such as around Joliet. And then finally, as I mentioned, installing a substantial amount of drainage and irrigation facilities with this project. The drainage along the side of the road, you know, it has many impacts to the roadway facility as well as the safety and whatnot. So we'll be putting in these, you know, 2 compliant drainage ditches along with crossing culverts to get the drainage from the west side to the east side, which is the natural path that it wants to go. And then we'll be rebuilding and reconstructing the majority of irrigation facilities. There's 14 irrigation crossings in this project, which vary from smaller culverts to really large ones. So those are kind of where we're headed here and what we're doing as the main improvements for the project. And with that, I'd like to pass it off to Rod. Or actually, sorry, I still have one more slide. So this is the travel lanes and the passing lane configuration. Just real quickly, 12 feet travel lanes, very standard, and it shows the 8-foot travel lanes. And then on the bottom figure, it shows the passing lane configuration, which is 2 lanes going in one direction and 1 opposing, again with the 8-foot shoulder. So we don't want to compromise on those shoulders. And now I can pass it on to Rod Nelson.
Very good. Thank you, Kirk. And again, thank you everyone for joining us today. My name is Rod Nelson. I want to briefly discuss a strategy that MDT adopted on all roadways in Montana, including this segment of US 212 between Red Lodge and Roberts. It's called Vision Zero. Vision Zero is a strategy to eliminate all traffic fatalities and serious injuries while increasing safe and healthy mobility for all. Tragically, in 2020, there were 212 fatalities on Montana roadways. Already in 2021, there have been 31 fatalities compared to 16 fatalities for the same time period in 2020. So you can see from the numbers, 2021 has had a very tragic start. When talking about Vision Zero, we often refer to the 5 E's as essential components. They are education, enforcement, emergency services, engineering, and everyone. The project that is being presented to you today is utilizing the engineering component of Vision Zero. But we also want to talk to you about the 5th component of Vision Zero, and that is everyone. To eliminate fatalities and serious injuries on the roads of Montana, we need everyone to do their part. We need everyone to be attentive. We need everyone to drive sober. We need everyone to drive to the conditions and not speed. And we need everyone to use their seatbelts. Please, together, we can save lives. So with that, Takami, back to you.
All right, as promised, my contact information is here should you wish to touch base about any questions or comments after the meeting. You are welcome to email me by typing my first name, which is TAKAMI at bigskypublicrelations.com. It's Big Sky Public Relations, all spelled out. Or you can call our project hotline, which is 406-207-4484. And that hotline is staffed by one of our colleagues Monday through Friday from 9 a.m. to 5 p.m. You're also welcome to visit our website at bit.ly.com/Red Lodge Roberts to learn more about the project. And you'll also be redirected to that site after the meeting, hopefully. And feel free to browse it at your convenience, and know that we will continue to update that website throughout the project's history. I'd like to now transition over to our exciting Q&A period. Katie, what questions do we have?
Thanks, Takami. And I'm going to leave my camera off as I'm reading. I tend to squint, so nobody needs to see that. And to get us started, Grant has a few questions for us that are really good, a lot about construction and what might look like afterwards. So Kirk, I'll kick a couple of these over to you first. So Grant is asking if there are any plans to add a separate pathway for bikes or even for buggies.
Well, the short answer is no. When this was looked at eventually, or originally, we looked at the widened shoulders, the 8-foot shoulders as being a venue for the bicyclists and pedestrians. The concept of the buggies actually didn't exist back when this project was conceived for me, which was in 2012. But as we've looked at that now, the 8-foot shoulder should be a great place to accommodate the buggies. Even if they're straddling the rumble strips, on the fog line, it'll still be a much safer place for them to be than kind of forced to be into the main travel lane.
Thanks, Kirk. And you did show a screen earlier in our presentation looking at some of the traffic plans and signage. So maybe we could go to that, because Grant is then asking if there are any plans to increase or decrease speed for safety.
Okay, here I'll share my screen. Okay, are you able to see my screen now?
We are.
Okay, close that down. So, yeah, again, going back to these plans, these show essentially where the passing lanes are. Katie, can you repeat again what the question was on this? As I was trying to fumble around here, I kind of lost my train of thought.
Oh, no, you were good. So there's actually two that maybe you could speak to on this. So the first was if there are plans to increase or decrease speed. And then the second is if there are going to be any wildlife crossings under the roadway. Okay,
so item number one is no, we are not planning to change the speed limits out here. In 2019, a traffic study was commissioned out here, and MDT evaluated this stretch of roadway and whether it would be appropriate to reduce speeds or not. And they based these on it truly is a speed zone study. There's specific requirements. And what they look at is the 85th percentile speeds of the people who are actually driving it. And if they see that people are driving over the speed limit by a certain margin, then they can assess and determine whether to impose a reduction in the speed limit. The findings of this speed study, however, did not indicate that any changes were necessary to the speed limits out here. So they will remain 70 daytime for passenger cars and normal vehicles, 65 at night. And for trucks, it would be 60 and 55. So those speed limits are not going to change. Part B, with regards to wildlife crossings, no, we are not proposing any wildlife crossings with this project. There are a handful of these culverts that might act as some form of a crossing mechanism for wildlife. However, we don't have any large structures that you would typically see like on US 93 or up in Canada for wildlife crossings going under or over. So hopefully that answers your question well enough.
Thanks, Kirk. And along those same lines, Grant is asking another question,
Mhm.
basically about the timing of this project. And his question is, why not take out some of the roadside vegetation now for preventing deer collisions?
Ah, I am actually going to turn that one over to the district administrator.
Yeah, thank you, Kirk. And actually, that's a great suggestion. And the answer is for that is we have been, but we can only do so much. I'm sure, as you are probably aware, the distance that we have to work with for taking out vegetation because of where the right-of-way line is at is fairly limited in a number of locations. But I'm sure as you've driven on that roadway over probably the last few months, you've noticed that we have been out cutting down trees and removing some of that vegetation for the very reason that you're suggesting. So yeah, thank you for that.
Well, and I might just follow up on that. I mean, so this exhibit basically shows here's 2 Mile Bridge Road. So here's the hospital in Red Lodge and north is to the right. These limits, these outer boundaries are proposed construction limits that we have, and MDT will be securing right away slightly farther than that in most cases. And so what you would end up with is that the vegetation would be cleared within those limits. So you get to some of these areas like down by the ponds, we're going to need to clear out that vegetation along through here. And I know there's that funnel right here by the gravel pit and whatnot that is very narrow. Again, that'll be knocked out. And this feature here right next to the gravel pit up here is a containment berm. There's a history of this hillside coming down and sliding up against the highway. And so we'll be putting in a gravity system here, just a big pile of rock essentially, so that if something comes down, it doesn't hit the highway. But as you look along through the project, you can see we're going to be pulling out a lot of the vegetation in those dense areas. And even where it's not that dense, the tall grass and stuff that occupies much of this will become, these ditches for roadside drainage. So the height element of that vegetation will kind of go away.
Thank you, Kirk. And while you have those plans up, it actually might be helpful to point out, if you could, to Grant's other question, where he's asking where the rumble strips will be placed.
Oh, sure. So rumble strips are now a requirement on the Montana state highways. And so rumble strips go on the fog line, which is right here under my hand. And in no passing zones and in partial passing zones, we implement the rumble strips in the center. Now, there are some locations where we do have opposing passing. So, in those locations, you don't have the center line rumble strips, but we'll always have those shoulder rumble strips.
Thanks, Kirk. Again, this display is really helpful because we're getting a lot of questions about the project area.
You bet.
So Erica is asking next if you could explain exactly where the fence will sit in the cross section of the map.
The cross section of the map. So fencing gets placed on the proposed right-of-way line, and I do not have the proposed right-of-way on with this scenario, but let's look at an example here where we have, construction limits that are out here. Let's say that the right-of-way, I'm going to have to move my picture here. Let's just say, for example, that we place the right-of-way limit right here. That's where you would see the fence be located, is on the proposed right-of-way line for the highway. We try to set aside the highway facility from private property in that fashion. And when negotiations are occurring between the department's personnel or the consultants they've chosen and the landowners, discussion on this type of fence occurs at that point in time. We have wildlife friendly fencing, which has smooth wire, on one or more strands so that animals can go over or under. And then for people who have cattle, for instance, if they want 4 or 5 strand barbed wire, that's how that comes into play. And so like in this case, the right of way would be here, somewhere in here. And then there's an easement that comes into play for the irrigation facility. So what you're seeing here is a relocated irrigation ditch that would be put outside of the proposed right of way. in its own little easement so that the operators have the ability to maintain the ditch. And these are crossing culverts, both for irrigation facilities and drainage, when you see something like that going across the road.
And so it's important to keep in mind that it's variable depending on the width of the roadway, the side slopes of the roadway, and what other roadway features there are. So that's partly why we can't give like a set distance, because it changes all throughout the project.
Yeah, and in some cases we have private drain fields that we need to avoid, or private wells or monitoring wells and things like that. And that's when you'll see some interesting things where we like dog leg or kick out right away or kick in right away, or construction limits do something a little strange in a location. So hopefully that kind of gives you guys a sense of what's happening out here.
Thank you, Kirk. And I did send a message, but if you do have any additional questions, Erica, please feel free to follow up. And I think that she just did as I say that. So she said the fence goes on the right-of-way line and then another 25 feet of easement past that. Is that correct, Kirk?
It could be, whether the easement ends up being that width or something different. Yeah, the irrigation easements are typically fixed at some increment of width based on the size of the facility. Some of the irrigation ditches are smaller than others. And really what we're trying to do is give some room on each side of the actual ditch for, an excavator or a backhoe or, somebody's 1-ton pickup or whatever to be able to run back and forth up and down along the sides of it.
Perfect, thank you. And then I think one last follow-up question on that same line is if when the stakes are out, when the survey crews are out there, is Erica's question is if that's where the fencing will likely go.
Rod, I don't know if they specifically stake the right-of-way during construction. I know they're going to stake the construction permit areas, but can you respond to that if come construction, if the stakes they see out there will be labeling the right-of-way?
They may or may not. So we put stakes out for different reasons. Sometimes it is for the right of way. Sometimes it is for where the construction limit is at. Sometimes it's for center. I mean, there's just various reasons for stakes. And so I really can't answer that without actually knowing the specific stake and how it is marked. I hope that answers your question. I'm not real sure of your question, if there's stakes out there right now, and that's what you're asking about, or when it comes time to actually construct the project.
Yeah, if you're working with your right-of-way agent and they have staked something for you, they would be the best one to answer what those stakes are and what they mean.
Yeah, again, keep in mind construction is a ways out with this project, and individual landowners can request to have this information staked if they so desire. We can send troops out there and put some right-of-way stakes out there, or easements or construction permit limits. Keeping in mind that until right-of-way negotiations are finished, those stakes can be temporary or preliminary, let's say.
Great. I think that hit that really well. Thank you. And Kirk, you were talking a little bit earlier about some utilities that might be happening in the area. And we did have a question asking more about that and if there will be utility improvements incorporated in the construction.
Well, not knowing exactly which utilities they're referring to, but utilities that are in the way typically get relocated, especially the ones on the surface. I can't say for sure where the gas and the fiber optic and underground power and telephone will go. Those kind of things are actually negotiated between MDT utility section and the utility companies. And, but more often than not, what you see is we move the power poles outside of the area of hazard. And most of the stuff that has been impacted adversely gets moved or shifted more or less towards the outside of the right of way.
Perfect. Thanks again, Kirk. Next question is if there have been any considerations made for the turning lanes at Foxed East Bench Road access. And then there's a comment that with increased traffic, whether unfamiliar roadway users and local business access for trucks, this is currently a hazardous area when attempting to turn onto Fox East Bench Road from either direction.
So I think we looked at this here in the last week or so, and we haven't identified that as being a spot for turning lanes. And while I've got folks here, I just happened to pull up guidelines for what we evaluate in putting in turn lanes. It's based on volume thresholds and the amount of opposing traffic. And I can tell you that the volumes along Highway 212, although they're uncomfortable because they're higher speeds, typically the turning volumes are such that they don't fall within this shaded area here for where you need to have a turn lane. It doesn't mean that we can't evaluate it further, look at more accident data and see if there's some engineering judgment that needs to come into play on that if it's changed. But I can tell you that, during the process of project development, we do go through and evaluate very carefully the accidents, the clusters, the locations, the causes of those accidents, and we try to identify if there's any cluster locations that pop out as being an area where we need to take a more careful look. So, this is a snapshot of what we had, a 5-year period back between 2007 and 11. There was 91 crashes. 34 of those were caused injuries. And the interesting one, which we always keep our eye on, is this one about the animal impacts. Not half, but not far off a half, involved animal collisions. And we all know as we drive this frequently, the white-tailed deer is pretty obnoxious out here. And there's been quite a few bear collisions as well. So we're hoping that with the opening up of this facility and widening and improving the sight distance and removing the vegetation, that we will see a noticeable improvement in this. Now, obviously the deer that are getting a running start at crossing the highway, we really aren't going to see a big change in the mortality of those animals, unfortunately. But those that are kind of staged along the road and playing chicken with you, you'll hopefully at least have the opportunity to slow down and assess the situation before proceeding forward.
Great, thanks, Kirk. Next, we had this question earlier today. There are a few folks asking about what the access might look like for the KOA. And so if we could maybe revisit that again this evening. Carrie is asking if we have any plans for a turn lane accessing the KOA.
So we don't have intentions for putting a turn lane in there. Now, I know this is something that's being discussed with the KOA a little bit during the right-of-way process. And I've heard that there's consideration or at least discussion ongoing about trying to get another access onto Highway 212. But again, based on the volume thresholds, it didn't warrant turn lane provision there. So, I think if they want more information obtained on this, or they want to share some information with us to help us better understand the peak flows and whatnot, when we might want to get some people out there and take a peek at it, we'd be happy to entertain that. But again, based on volume thresholds, it doesn't quite hit it, even with the slow, RV pulling boat scenarios or even larger Greyhound bus style. It hasn't shown itself to us. So if there's more data we should consider, we'd be happy to take a look at that.
Thanks, Kirk. And that actually segues really well into a question that we have from Paula. So she's sharing that she's a school dress, excuse me, I tried to make that two words into one. She's a school bus driver for the Red Lodge school system. And she said that her route is the east bench from 2 Mile Bridge to Fox. And so what she's sharing is that when she comes onto Highway 212 from the 2 Mile Bridge Road, that she has some safety concerns with the speed of oncoming traffic. And her question is then that she's heard that there may be a roundabout being installed in that junction. So she's curious if that's happening, and then shares that it might be advantageous for reducing speeds.
So yeah, very loaded question. The roundabout is proposed with the adjacent project. This is the one that Cameron was referring to as Robinson Lane to 2 Mile Bridge Road. And so that would be located here with that project, and it is that transition element from the high-speed environment to the north to the lower speed environment. The community has had concerns since I've been involved, clear back in 2009, with the speeds through this area. This was predated the hospital by quite a bit. But there was concern that this speed was, people would just continue on zooming through. And the solution that we presented to the mayor and city council was that, you know, it requires enforcement to make change at a place like this until we can get this thing in here. So now, yes, you're right. We will have north or southbound vehicles having to slow down and negotiate this roundabout at 20 to 25 miles per hour tops, and then come out of the other side into a lower speed zone. So we do have a speed reduction to 45 that starts somewhere in here. That's proposed along with this. And of course, there's been a lot of speed stuff done in here. And I did mention the speed study recommended no change in this area, which continued actually quite a ways to the north.
Thanks, Kirk and Paula. If that didn't fully address your question, or if there's anything more, please feel free to include that in the continued Q&A. So with that, there are a number of questions here. I guess we'll just start back up from the top. So Frank is asking if MDT will be providing for a 2-car width approach at the subdivision and public road access. And then he makes the point that at least 2 of which are within the passing lane stretch of south of Roberts.
I guess I don't know what location we're talking about, but as negotiations occur on, you know, with individual landowners and parcels, the discussion of access comes up more frequently than not. I'll guarantee you that. And as I said before, you know, this is an access control project. And with that, there's an access control resolution that's been passed by the Transportation Commission. And so what you see with the approaches that have been drawn in here, which my hand is on, hopefully you all can see that, is where we've identified them to be most appropriate. We've taken, you know, approaches that come in at a fairly sharp angle, and we've straightened them out at the intersection with the highway to help people so they can see left and right. Looking over your left shoulder is not an easy thing, especially if there's a really sharp angle. And so where we've put approaches is where we would like to see them. And then during the negotiation process, that can come back to us with some suggested changes or some questions regarding whether it would be appropriate to relocate. But we try to put these approaches in many cases. Let's say there's a property line here and there's a property to the north and south. We try to put it on the common lot line. So some of these have been slightly adjusted. Some of them have been noticeably adjusted. And those are the kind of things that we take, or MDT and its negotiators take to the public individually, and then we see if it works for them functionally. And we have had a lot of conversations with landowners over the years as well.
Yeah, and I think we could just probably speak to that public roads are wider than private approaches. I don't know, Kirk, if you have that width off the top of your head or not, but they're much wider. And then roads that access multiple properties are also wider than some private approaches as well.
Yeah, so we start with a 24-foot standard approach width, and you know, you might see that this one down here is narrower, and that's something that's come back to us. And then when it comes to commercial property access, you know, ingress and egress, depending upon what needs to get in there, we look at the design vehicles. You know, maybe they have a large service truck or a, you know, a carrier truck from the interstate. We may have to look at widening these out based on the information and feedback we get from them. We don't purposely put in large approaches because they don't get used for their full width on most cases. And it's expensive and it's a maintenance item. So we do start with the standard 24-foot approach, and that allows for essentially 12-foot in each direction, which is usually more than adequate for most approaches along a rural highway.
And will be a significant increase to most of the approach widths that are out there currently as well.
Yeah, in fact, it feels kind of funny sometimes for us to put in a 24 approach to somebody's 8-foot driveway. And often you'll see this, right? We put in this approach to this width and we taper down to that. So at least it gives them a nice large facility to pull on and off the roadway and feel safe. And then we do that taper down to their existing widths.
Great, thanks, Cameron. Kirk, that was really helpful. Next, we have a question again from Grant, who's wondering if there will be any significant relocation or realigning of the highway as part of this project.
Well, I guess by terms of significant, that's a fairly qualitative statement. I can say we have anywhere from 4 to 16 feet of alignment shift, depending on where you are. When you go to the south end of the project, I mentioned this before, how we have all of that water kind of weeping out of the hillside to the west of the highway. And we really don't want to get into digging into that hillside and opening up, you know, an artesian well. We get enough moisture as it stands. So we have largely looked at trying to hold or largely hold the west edge of the roadway where it is today. And then in that first mile, we shifted to the east to try to, again, minimize those impacts to the water features. You know, there's private ponds along here, and we don't want to get into the berms of those ponds either. So there's an alignment shift. This is by far the biggest one, is in that first mile. And then when we get up to the community of Fox, we had, sorry, I went too far here. In Fox, we had an alignment shift of around 4 feet. And the reason for that was, again, because the majority of the residences were on the west side. And we had the opportunity to move it to the east because of the grain bin area and all that. So we made a shift there. And then at the very north end, where this project connects into the other project, it's difficult to see here, but there's actually an alignment shift to the east. And that was because predominantly the landowners on the west side, all owned by one family, the right-of-way that the existing right-of-way limit on this side was smaller than what was available on the east side. So we were taking, with following the existing center line, we were actually taking an unequal portion of right-of-way from the west side of the road. So we shifted it 12 feet to the east for some distance, probably close to a mile through here, before going back again to match the center line of the existing roadway. The other things that come into play with this is, you know, when we have the passing lane construction and some of that extra asphalt, we have to weigh in where we want the center line a little bit. But generally speaking, no major alignment shifts going through houses and private property and structures.
Thanks, Kirk. Next, we have a couple different questions about roundabouts. I might loop those together. First, Kirk, could you clarify for John? He's asking if we could clarify that the roundabout that we were talking about earlier is either part of this project, or if that part is or if that is part of the segment that is on hold.
It's part of the segment on hold. It is not where these yellow lines start here and the various lines. That's where we start our project full width going to the north. The rest of this going in clear as far as Robinson Lane or thereabouts is part of that other segment we call Robinson to 2 Mile.
Perfect. And then next, there's a question if there are any roundabouts involved, like at the 2 Mile Bridge intersection or near Beartooth Creek. So maybe clerk, if you could just clarify if there are any roundabouts as part of this project.
No, not as part of this project. But again, when they say 2 mile road, that yes, it is here with the other project.
Great, thank you. The next question, there are a couple related to construction once we get to that phase. So first, Brian is asking what the typical delay or additional travel time might be anticipated once we are into construction.
I don't know how to put my arms around that one. Rod, do you? I mean, this would be a construction project without detouring traffic. That's how we've got the special provision for the contractor written, where they will essentially try to tear up and resurface or get to a drivable surface on one side before moving over to the other side and working on that side. So you would see, one travel lane likely for some period of time in the areas where it's just 2-lane reconstruction, and you'd have flaggers and pilot cars. The area where we have the passing lanes, however, we have more width to work with. And so in that scenario, what we'd like to see from the contractor is to build the embankment on whichever side, get that area kind of off the main line built up, and then start looking at how to shift traffic back and forth. But it's one of those scenarios where we anticipate they're going to be shifting traffic back and forth, left to right, to make sure that they can get drivable surfaces installed prior to winter shutdown.
Yeah, Kirk, so I think you described that quite well. And I think typical is the key word here. Typically, we do not allow a contractor in our specifications to exceed more than 15 minutes of delay. So to answer your question about typical, that would probably be typical, no more than 15 minutes.
Thanks, Rod. That's really helpful. And I think we have a question somewhat related to that. And Kirk, you touched on it, but maybe could you specify plans when construction is starting? Granted, we don't know everything quite yet, but Kathy is asking how traffic might be routed during active construction, especially if there are considerations with the tourist season. And then specifically, she's asking if there will be a separate road for folks to drive on or a different detour route, I'm guessing.
Yeah, we're not actually anticipating detours, although within the contract, we provide a quantity for traffic gravel, which allows the contractor to shift traffic off to one side, maybe even outside the prism of what will be the reconstructed surface. So, in this case, you would not see it in this first mile because it's steep and nasty on the west side and it drops off on the east side. So, the amount of material that would be required there would be pretty substantial to give a temporary driving surface. But that is one mechanism that they can choose to do. But again, at this point, we're not anticipating rerouting any traffic onto the county roads or certainly any local roads, for instance, on the bottom of the screen, something to divert around a zone. We have a lot of crossing culverts. Those present some challenges with installation on a 2-lane roadway because you do have to close one half of the road at a bare minimum or bore underneath the road, which can be pretty expensive and difficult also, but it can save a ton on motorist delay and perhaps overall expense on traffic control for the contractor. In an area like this, you're not going to see them boring under there because of the water.
Thank you, Kirk. If there's nothing more to add on construction, there is a question from Keel, and the question is if there are any plans for dust suppression and roadway maintenance on Clear Creek Road or East Bench Road during construction, asking if this will then take on more local traffic and then therefore if there will be other maintenance needs addressed.
Well, I'll answer part of that. Again, it sounds like they're asking if traffic is going to be detoured onto Bench. Within the limits of project construction, MDT does require dust suppression within the construction limits. So stuff that might be off the site, I guess I can't really speak to that. And I'm not sure, Rod, if you want to chime in on that as far as the dust suppression requirements of a project.
Yeah, so, and I certainly understand and appreciate the question, because I think we all know that there's going to be people that try to go around the construction of the highway. And so they'll be trying to take different routes, and that increased traffic then will provide more dust than what is typically there when construction isn't in place or ongoing. So we will engage Carbon County, and we will talk to them about that and see if we can't come up with some plan in order to deal with that situation if it should arise.
Thanks, Rob. That's great. Next, and we just, with being cognizant of time, we just have about 4 minutes and 2 questions left. So we should be wrapping up right on track, everybody. With that, we have Amy's question, and she is asking that when construction does start, if there's an idea of if construction would be on the north or the south end of the corridor.
Yeah, I mean, that's really largely up to the contractor on how they want to sequence their work. We do break these projects into zones. However, now this project is a complete pulverization project, so the operation can go sequentially and logically for what works best for the contractor. And certainly we want to make sure that whatever that is, it works the best for the traveling public and to minimize impedance to the event traffic and stuff on the weekends that result. So I don't know that I can say which end they will start with. You know, if I was them, I'd probably pick some of the easy stuff, but which would be at the north end. But I don't know, Rod, if you have anything else you'd want to add on that. I mean, there is flexibility for them to choose how they want to get this conducted unless we tell them specifically.
Yeah, that's right, Kirk. And so, you know, at this time, we don't have any plans of putting that into our contract as far as where to start. So as what Kirk said, depending on the contractor, depending on how they're planning on doing what segment, when, what time of the year, all that comes into play. So at this time, no, we don't know if it's going to start on the north or the south or the middle for that matter.
That's really helpful context, Rod. And I think the last question that we have around construction somewhat builds off of that. And so Tracy is asking if it's known yet if the contractor will have 1 year or longer from the start of the project to finish their construction.
Rod, I'll let you. I mean, we have a number of contract days, but not knowing exactly when the contract will be let kind of plays into that as far as whether it rolls into 2 seasons or not.
Yep, that's exactly right, Kirk. And so we do in our contract what we'll come up with, and we haven't yet, but we will come up with a number of days that the contractor has to complete the project in. And during the course of the winter, we typically don't count those days in that. So as an example, for whatever reason, maybe we go to contract in the middle of the summer and we give them 180 days to complete the project. They're not going to be able to complete all of that project during that first summer. So it'll carry over through the winter and possibly into the next construction season too.
Thanks, Rod. And just so in the interest of time, we just have about 1 minute left. And I see we have 2 questions from Kim. Kim will answer your first one. And if we have time, we can certainly get to the next. But otherwise, Takami can follow up since those are construction related questions. So there's just a lot of balls up in the air still. But we can probably answer the next one in a concrete fashion, excuse my pun. And Kim is asking if there will be another update or a virtual meeting for this project.
Takami, I think that's in your ballywag for this project.
You know, it's so fun that I finally get a question after all this time. I've just always been listening to you guys. So the short answer for US 212 is yes, we are going to definitely go back out into the community, especially for all of these other projects on the corridor. for this project specifically, it's certainly something that we can continue to look at, especially as the timeline progresses. If, you know, we're seeing that it's been a while since we've gotten out and met with the community, it's definitely something that we can do again. And I also want to hear feedback from you all as well on that. I also wanted to point out that this is not our only avenue to communicate. So you will be seeing me hopefully at some fun events in Red Lodge around like farmers markets, or you might see me tabling at different, I don't know, just random events around the community. You will also be providing quarterly updates about this project throughout its history, and we'll start, that will turn into construction updates, which are weekly. So there's multiple avenues that we will use to get the message out and continue to communicate with you all. I just wanted to make sure you all are aware about that, and that if you ever have any questions about the project, you're welcome to reach out to me via email, phone, or my contact information is on the website as well. So I did want to point that out. And just checking on our time. Oh, it looks like we are after time. Sorry, Kim, about your last question, but I will work on getting that information over to you. And I just wanted to say thank you everyone for your time this evening. It has been a pleasure just talking with you all and hearing your questions. And again, I do want to reiterate that I'm always here if you have any questions or concerns. And this will definitely not be the last time that you hear from us about this project. So I look forward to communicating more. And thank you all for your time this evening. Really appreciate it. Great conversation, and hope you guys have a wonderful evening. Thanks.